fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. In the last video, I talked about genre and some of the elements of each of them. And honestly, there's a good chance that I actually do individual videos for each of the genres simply because there's so much information about them. Today, I want to go over an extremely important aspect to consider when starting a new project, and that is perspective. Perspective is a bit of an umbrella term, as it involves a variety of topics. However, let's back up just a little bit. Just as genre is French for to sort, perspective comes from the Latin word perspicio, or perspicere, depending on your source. To be fair, I'm not entirely certain that pronunciation is exact. For each of the words, some pronounce the C as a K, as I've done, or as an S. Of course, if you know the correct way, leave a comment below. The definition of perspicio is to observe, which, again, makes a lot of sense. Perspective means viewpoint, and in literature refers to the narrator's outlook. Because of that, we get three different terms: the unreliable narrator, the naive narrator, and the reliable or truthful narrator. A naive narrator is one who knows a limited amount about the story. Their information is reliable, there's just not enough of it. A reliable narrator is one who knows pretty much everything about the story and is not attempting to subvert the audience or reader, or is not trying to hide something from them. A reliable narrator is willing to tell everything that they know in service of the story. As you can imagine, an unreliable narrator is actively hiding information from the reader. But let's be clear here. An unreliable narrator is not lying to the reader. The difference here is that they are reserving key pieces of information. What they tell is unreliable because it is not the full picture. But at the same time, they're not reserving everything. They're only doling out small bits, because if they kept everything back, then the reader could never figure out what's going on. But as we get closer to the writing process, we'll get into their uses. First, we should discuss the narration itself, as it's the primary driving force behind the story's telling. Overall, narration is exactly how it sounds, narrating the story, and the narrator is the voice of the person doing that telling, which brings us to the next term to know: point of view. Often expressed in shorthand as POV, point of view is exactly that: how close the narrator is to the unfolding events of the story. Imagine this: you're out for a drive, and you come to a scenic viewpoint, a place to stop and look at something particularly beautiful. From that viewpoint, how close is what you're looking at? Is it near? Is it far? Is it above you? Or is it below? This is the essence of point of view within literature. Now, there are three types of POV. There is first person, second person, and third person. Two are above the action, watching it unfold, and one is right in the action. So which is which? First person is the direct observations of the main character. This is the only perspective to be right in the thick of the events. It is characterized by the use of I when describing action, such as, I jumped over the fence. First-person narration is always limited, as the narrator can only view so far. Nothing is told that the character cannot see. They can only speculate. First person is often considered naive for this reason. The character can't know everything and is therefore in the dark about a lot of information. However, first person can also be unreliable because it is up to the character what they tell the reader. They can leave information out or spin things to their own way of thinking, describe things in a more exaggerated way. The next POV is second person. Second person is perhaps the rarest perspective in literature. I'll explain why later, but for now know that second person is above the action, whereas first person is inside the action. Second person is characterized by the use of you when describing action. So where first person was I jumped over the fence, second person is you jumped over the fence. Second person is rarely unreliable because the narration is directly describing the action. Second person is usually limited in its scope, simply because it's following the reader/main character. And lastly is third person. Third person is the final above the action perspective. It is characterized by the use of character names or pronouns when describing action. First is I jumped over the fence. Second person is you jumped over the fence. So using character names, third person would be Steve jumped over the fence. Between the three styles, third person has the most range. It can be limited, meaning it follows only one character. It can be omniscient, which means all-knowing. This means that it sees all action at all times within the story and is up to you, the author, to decide what to show when. It allows the narrator to jump between events happening concurrently within the story. Third person can be reliable or unreliable, but is rarely naive. And that is only because third person can see so much more than the other two perspectives. But there's another classification for third person that you should know, and that is objective, where third person limited focuses on a main character sitting just over their shoulder, looking down at all the action. It can hear their thoughts, feel their feelings, and express them on the page. Omniscient does this for everyone, whereas objective delves into none of the feelings, none of the emotions, none of the thoughts, and merely describes the action. It can do this in great detail, but gets into nothing below the surface. So, now that you know the various narration types, what are the pros and cons of each? First person is usually considered the most approachable. All an author has to do is put themselves in the shoes of the main character and start walking. First person POV is everything that they can see. However, there is a major downside to first person. There is no sense of peril. Why? If a story is being told in first person, then the main character has to survive in order to tell it. Now, that's not to say the main character can't be imprisoned, but they definitely survive the events of the story. For this reason, it's best to use first person when death is not a possibility. Anytime I read a book and see first person, I know the main character is making it through. The author may make it seem like they're in danger, but they're the ones telling the story. That means they survive. The only way around this is to have them acknowledge a fatal wound, that with their dying breath, they're telling the story of how it all happened. So please, if you intend to put your main character in danger, don't use first person. Far too many new authors do this, and it just kills any interest in the story. A fight to the death in first person is the fastest way to reveal the ending. Before moving on to second person, I want to bring up a phenomenon in literature called head hopping. This is when narration will bounce between the thoughts of multiple people within a scene. Some see it as a detractor for third-person narration, but the greater offense is putting it in a first-person story in order to get the thoughts of multiple people. Switching narration in a first-person story is fine, but not within a single scene. If you denote different chapters with different characters' names who are the primary focus, you can do a version of head hop. But that only works when the focus is singular within that section. If you need to hear the thoughts of multiple people, your best bet is to change perspective types. If we're hearing multiple thoughts, third person is probably the best way to go because that is where it is most possible and most accepted. It is far too confusing and disrupting in first person. Now, as I said, second person is the rarest perspective in literature. When I was learning about the various perspectives, there was almost nothing on second person because the focus is always on first and third. In second person, the narrator does know more than in first person, but not by much. The story is still centered on a single character, which is you. But the difference here is that the narrator can look in different directions and describe more of what's going on. They're not just locked within the character's vision, they are above the character and therefore can look all around. When it comes time to act, viewpoint is always locked and limited. The other problem is believability. Because second person is always from the standpoint of you, there is the possibility that the reader can disagree. You jumped over the fence. No, I didn't. Because it's telling the reader what they do within the story. If they can spot a better option, but the narration doesn't, a disconnect happens. When the reader does not accept what the narrator says, you've lost them as a reader. Second person is the only perspective where the reader can disagree. It's for this reason that second person is the rarest. It's for this reason that so many people avoid it and rarely talk about it. It's so difficult to pull off and do well that most people don't even bother learning about it. Now, third person is sometimes considered the most difficult of the three. It's also the most versatile. The reason it's considered difficult is because how much the narrator, and by extension the author, has to know. With limited third person, the narration only follows one character. Objective third person follows multiple characters throughout the story, but doesn't delve into feelings and thoughts. And lastly, omniscient third follows multiple characters and has the ability to dive inside their emotions and thoughts and feelings. Omniscient is the most open form, but it also requires you, the author, to know the most. You have to see everything, plan everything, and know what's happening at all points in the story. Considering life happens concurrently, events in your story are doing so as well. They don't wait to happen until we see them. Because of that, you'll see stories bouncing between events, whether that's within a chapter, within a scene. They may go back and forth, usually with some sort of denotation. That is the hallmark of omniscient third person. I believe that this makes stories stronger because it allows readers to understand more, to find sympathy in otherwise unsympathetic characters. It allows you to build more tension by showing things happening at the same time. A good use for third omniscient is when you have a lot of characters. It allows you and the reader to keep track of them a little easier. But because omniscient allows writers to delve into thoughts, it does get difficult to know who knows what. Was the information said, or was it just thought by someone? That means that you, the author, need to find a way to differentiate the two. That way both you and the reader can tell the difference between what people know, what is said, what is thought, what is known, and what is unknown. Because as humans, we don't actually hear thoughts. Those are personal, those are internal. In a third omniscient novel, they can be external. But at the same time, unless a character is telepathic, no one is supposed to be able to hear those thoughts. And a common way to differentiate them is to put thoughts in italics. That way it stands out against speech. Another thing to consider is that having so many options can sometimes hamper the writing process. Too many choices or options can lead to a type of writer's block. What to see next, where to go next, what to do next. Many writers will avoid this by putting limitations on how they tell the story. The other two big negatives for omniscient third are the show don't tell conundrum and the head hopping issue. Though in third person, head hopping can work a lot better than it does in first person. Imagine a movie One character is talking, and in the middle of the speech, the view cuts to another character. Maybe they're reacting. Maybe they're doing something like pouring a cup of coffee while they listen. This is action hopping. Now, in a story, there's a possibility of, when jumping to the second character getting coffee, that we hear their thoughts. That's more than likely unnecessary. It can be useful at times, but in limited use. It's best to just keep to their reactions and leave it at that. Head hopping can have use, but as I said, that use is limited. So keep your inclusion of it limited as well. Which brings us to the age-old problem, the show don't tell conundrum. And it's usually an omniscient that we get more of this. If you don't know, show don't tell is when you have a character describing something, usually action. So they'll be talking and they'll be telling us about something instead of us seeing. In that way, you are telling the reader about something interesting that happened instead of showing them. An easy way around this can often just be starting to tell and then doing a quick cut to the actual action and then quick cut back for the end of the story. This way we still know that they're telling, but you're actually showing. And the reason that they rail against the telling aspect is because it's disengaging. If all of your action is heard secondhand, if all of it is told by a character, or if some of it is told by a character within the story, relaying information to other characters, it's not as interesting. We want to be a part of it. We want to be in the story. We want to see it unfold. We want to feel the action. We want to imagine it. We don't just want to be told. That takes the fun out of the reading. I've seen examples where the telling aspect, instead of showing, does work, but they're limited in scope. And when I say limited, I mean extremely limited. Usually it happens with something like describing character emotion. When a character is describing their emotional state, which some may consider telling instead of showing, I actually sometimes consider it showing and not just telling. Why? Because they usually give examples. They have to describe the emotion. They have to describe how heavy or how deep it is. And because they give examples, this then becomes showing. Part of this process of knowing which to use and when will take practice on your part. And part of it will be determining which works best for the story you want to tell itself. Now, if all that sounds complicated, it's because it can be. Another thing to consider when discussing perspective is tense. The past, present, and future walk into a bar, and it was tense. When we talk about tense, we're talking about when the events of the story take place. Either they have happened, are happening, or will happen. Two of the most common tenses are past and present, and they work across all perspectives. An example of each tense can be shown with just a single word: said, says, will say. As you can see, future tense is a little harder to manage. It's hard to imagine telling a story that hasn't technically happened yet. For that reason, past and present tenses are much more common for authors to use. Though one thing I do want to point out is that past tense is usually the preferred tense of traditional publishing. It's how some of the most famous authors have been telling stories for literally hundreds of years, even in first-person stories. A lot of new authors will go with present tense to try and be different, but with so many doing so, they're not different. Another thing to keep in mind is you want to avoid tense shifts. That means if you start in past tense, stay in past tense. Don't shift to present tense for a section and then go back. There is one way and one way only in which you can have a tense shift, and that's when you include an anecdotal passage or sage observation. In this way, the narration separates from the main story in order to offer an observation that is universally true, or a relevant anecdote. An example would be, night is always dark, yet that night seemed far darker than any other. Night is present tense, and it's a universal observation. That night seemed is past tense and begins the narration of the story. In this example, this would be something that happens at, say, the beginning of chapter 1. And that way, you can tell something or say something that is interesting, that is thought-provoking, and still universal. Night is always dark, yet that night seemed darker than most. It's a way to draw in the reader. It's a way to make them understand. It's a way to make them feel and draw out whatever sense or emotion you want. Now, that's just an example of the phenomenon. But as long as you keep it to 1 or 2 lines, it should work just fine. But I would also keep it to once, maybe twice per book. Any more than that, and it's no longer an anecdotal thought or sage observation, it's tense shift. You don't want to do that. You don't want to keep peppering your story with these back and forths. Just keep it to 1 or 2, keep it very simple, and it'll work. But beyond that, it absolutely doesn't. What it does is it takes the reader out of the story. It removes them from the flow of the narration, and you don't want that. The reason it takes them out of the story is because it becomes exponentially harder to follow once we have that added X factor. Once we don't know what time it is, or we have to think about when it is and what we know now and did we know it, and there becomes too many variables for the reader to follow. So every single time you change tenses, the story gets harder and harder to follow. And like I said, unless the tense shift is a clear removal from the narration, is a clear separation between the two, an observation and narration, and there's ground in between, night is always dark, yet that night seemed darker than all the rest. As long as it is something like that, it works. If it is not, it's much harder to see. And the last thing you want to do is confuse the reader. You know, there's a lot of lasts that you don't want to do. There's a lot of last things that I've been given advice on, but there's a lot that will harm the reading experience. The real last thing that you don't want to do is confuse, upset, or turn off a reader. That is what we as authors are trying to avoid, turning off a reader from our work. And everything just feeds into that worst case scenario. But that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, if you have something that you want me to expand on, any of these topics that we've discussed today, feel free to let me know and leave a comment below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, alchemists, take care.